think you are looking at a mountain. Pale stone, a steep face rising from a valley floor. A few dark openings at irregular heights, like marks left by weather or time. But those openings are doors. And behind each one, a family is sitting down to dinner tonight, as they did last night. As they have done, without interruption, for longer than most countries have existed. This is Iran. Not the Iran of headlines and satellite images and political commentary. The other Iran. The one that has been quietly here all along. Older than anything the news cycle knows how to talk about. Villages where the architecture is not built onto the landscape but grown from it. Out of the same volcanic stone. The same river clay, the same compressed earth that surrounds them. Indistinguishable from the hillside at certain angles, visible only when you know to look. Villages where the kitchen fire has not gone out in 1,000 years. Where the path between two houses passes across a third family's roof. Where bread is made to last weeks, not days, because the nearest road is 3 hours by foot. And there is no point planning for anything less than a season. 7 settlements, 7 geographies, 7 communities that arrived at the same answer to the same question the landscape kept asking. How do you build a life in a place that was not designed for one? You read the rock, you read the slope, you read the wind and the water and the particular way the light falls in this specific valley at this specific hour. And then you build accordingly. Not what you imagined. What the ground will allow. This is that Iran. Welcome. Kandavan. Northwestern Iran, the volcanic foothills of Mount Sahand, roughly 60 kilometers south of Tabriz. The elevation here sits above 2,200 meters. In winter, the valley holds snow for months. In summer, the light is thin and bright in the way of high places, the shadows hard-edged against pale stone. The formations rise from the valley floor in irregular clusters. Some taller than a 4-story building. Others squat and wide, their surfaces pocked with openings at varying heights. They are the color of dry bread at midday and the color of embers at dusk. The volcanic tufa from which they were formed, hardened ash and lava deposited across thousands of years, weathers differently at different densities, the softer layers eroding faster, the harder layers resisting. And the result is these shapes, tapered, textured, nothing like anything a human hand would produce unaided. Except that the human hands are there. Have been there, shaping these cones from the inside for at least 700 years. The walls of a Kandavan dwelling are nearly 2 meters thick at the base. This is not a design choice in the modern sense. It is a consequence. The stone that was removed to create the room is the same stone that now insulates the room. The act of excavation and the act of construction are the same act. What remains after carving is the shelter. In the early morning, smoke rises from the topmost openings of the cones where fires are lit to heat water before the valley fully wakes. The sound of copper kettles, voices passing between adjacent cones along paths so narrow that 2 people must negotiate passage with a sideways step. Children running between chambers through interior passages that connect the levels, their footsteps swallowed by the stone before they reach the next room. The kitchen inside a Kandavan cone sits at the lowest habitable level, where the walls are thickest, the temperature most stable. The hearth is cut directly into the stone floor. The depression where the cooking pot rests has been worn smooth by generations of the same placement, the same weight, the same small rotation as the pot is checked and adjusted. The ceiling above the cooking area carries a record of every meal prepared in that room. Soot layered in gradations of black and grey, thicker toward the center where the smoke concentrates, thinning toward the walls. Not as evidence of neglect, as the accumulated record of a domestic life, written in smoke rather than ink. The tufa insulates with a consistency that modern building materials in the same climate do not match. In summer, the interior temperature remains stable while the valley bakes. In winter, the walls absorb the heat of the fire slowly and return it through the night, the warmth outlasting the flame that created it. Tea is prepared on coal embers in copper vessels that have, in some households, not left the cave in living memory. Served in small glasses, held with both hands against the cold that seeps through even 2 meters of stone when the temperature outside drops below zero. Younger families now weigh this insulation against the absence of running water on upper levels. The impracticality of plumbing a structure that was never designed to accommodate it. The difficulty of everything requiring effort, water, fuel, groceries, carried upstairs too narrow for anything with wheels. This tension has not been resolved. The stone does not negotiate, but most families stay. The reason, when you ask, is rarely sentimental. The cold is the first answer. The insulation of 2 meters of volcanic tufa against an Azari winter is not a metaphor or a tradition. It is a physical fact that no amount of modern heating has made irrelevant. The cone is warmer. It has always been warmer. It will continue to be warmer regardless of what the world outside it is doing. The second answer, when it comes, is harder to articulate. Something about the sound. The particular way that voices and footsteps and the noise of a household are absorbed by the stone rather than reflected by it. The silence that the tufa produces when nothing is happening is different from the silence of an ordinary room. Deeper, more complete, a quiet that feels structural rather than incidental. Families who have left for apartments in Tabriz describe missing this specific silence in ways they find difficult to explain to people who have never experienced it. A silence that is not the absence of noise, but the presence of something that noise cannot penetrate. In autumn, the surfaces of the cones shift color as the light changes angle. By late afternoon, when the sun is low and the valley fills with amber light, the formations glow in a way that seems to come from within rather than from outside, as though the volcanic origin of the stone has retained some residual warmth from its formation and releases it slowly into the cooling air. Photographers come from a distance to capture this hour. The families who live here barely register it anymore. The oldest trees in the valley were planted by people who are now represented only by the soot on the ceilings of their former rooms. The trees have outlived the names of their planters. The cones may outlive the names of everyone currently living in them. That thought is not distressing to the people who live here. It is simply the nature of the material they inhabit. Masule. On the eastern face of the Alborz Range, where moisture from the Caspian Sea pushes inland and collides with the northern slopes of Iran's greatest mountain barrier, the weather is unlike anywhere else in the country. Fog arrives without warning and stays without schedule. Rain falls through sunshine. The hillsides are covered in oak and hornbeam and wild fig and a dozen other species that have no business existing this far into what is otherwise an arid country. The air smells of wet stone and wood smoke and something green and persistent that has no single name. Masule occupies a gradient so extreme that conventional building became impossible here. The hillside inclines at nearly 60 degrees. There is no flat ground. There is no ground on which a normal structure could stand without extraordinary foundations. The solution arrived at across generations is this. Each household's roof is the next household's street. The village rises in stacked tiers, each level set back from the one below, each roof a pedestrian surface for the neighbors above. There are no roads through Masule. There are no roads to most of it. The passages that connect the levels are wide enough for a person carrying a load and no wider. On any given morning, the rooftop surfaces carry the full texture of life simultaneously. A woman hanging laundry beside the chimney stack of the family below her. Two men in discussion over a shared wall, neither fully in the other's space. A child running the full length of a neighbor's roof because it functions, practically speaking, as a playground and always has. The fog moves through the lower levels while the upper tiers sit in pale autumn light. At eye level, grandmothers in layered skirts sit in doorways, watching the cloud fill the valley below with a patience that suggests they have watched this specific transition many thousands of times before. The kitchen defines the day at Masule more than any clock. By mid-morning, the smell of ash, the long-simmered soup of wild herbs, dried pulses, handmade noodles, and whatever the season offers from the forests above the village, has moved through every passage in the settlement, rising with steam through open doorways, dispersing into the damp mountain air. Ash is not a recipe here so much as a practice. A daily act of patience that the stone walls reward by absorbing its warmth slowly and returning it through the night. Women speak Gilaki among themselves while they cook. A language older than Farsi in its spoken form, passed from mother to daughter in the same narrow rooms over the same pots where it has always been spoken. The mountain does not interrupt this transmission, it organizes it. In autumn, the fog comes earlier. The light on the tiers turns amber. The walnut trees above the village drop their leaves, and the forests thin and the paths between households are covered in something that compresses softly underfoot and smells of the season turning. The household that was at the top of the village is still at the top of the village, has been, in some cases, for 2 or 3 centuries. The view from that roof has not changed except for the slow growth of the trees. The practical consequence of a village built this way, every roof a road, every structure dependent on the structural integrity of the one below it, is that the community cannot afford the deterioration of any single building. A roof that fails is not just a domestic problem, it is a problem for the household above it, whose floor has now become unreliable. This enforced interdependence produces a maintenance culture that operates not from civic virtue, but from structural necessity. You repair your roof because your neighbor's daily life depends on your roof. The construction material of Masule is a mixture of clay, straw, and sand specific to this hillside. The proportions were determined not through analysis, but through the failure of earlier buildings and the adjustment of subsequent ones. a process that took generations and produced a formula that the current residents apply without needing to understand its chemistry. The formula works. It has worked for centuries. The chemistry is irrelevant. In summer, the upper rooftops are kitchen gardens. Tomatoes and herbs in clay pots, drying fruit laid on flat surfaces in the morning sun. The smell of ripe tomatoes and wood smoke mixing in the passages between households in the warmest weeks. The fog returns in September. By October, it is present most mornings, sitting in the valley below the village, while the upper tiers stand clear in late-season light. By November, the leaves have gone from the forests above and the village is exposed, the full profile visible from the valley floor for the first time since spring. In winter, the rooftops are swept clear of snow before they become load-bearing problems for the floors below. This task falls without assignment to whoever is nearest and able. The roof is cleared because the roof must be cleared. Ownership is not the relevant category. Practicality is. The women who speak Gilaki while they cook are not preserving a language. They are speaking the language they know. The distinction matters. Preservation implies an effort, a decision, a consciousness of threat. What happens in these kitchens is simpler and more durable than preservation. It is use. Palangan. In the Tangier Canyon of Iranian Kurdistan, two limestone walls rise from either side of a narrow valley with enough height and proximity to cast each other in partial shadow through the middle hours of the day. Palangan occupies both cliff faces simultaneously. Buildings stacked in ascending rows on each wall, a river running approximately 60 meters below. More than 20 mineral springs descending from the rock faces above, feeding cold water channels that thread through the settlement at multiple levels before dropping toward the canyon floor. The village moves vertically in a way that flat settlements never do. A woman descending from the upper tier to collect spring water passes 3 other households in the process, pausing at each the way a person pauses at an intersection. Briefly, with acknowledgement, the small social tax of a community built on stairs rather than streets. Men returning from the fish channels in the afternoon carry trout through the same stepped passages that school children use going the opposite direction. The traffic moves in both directions without a system. Everyone knows the passages well enough not to need one. The mineral spring water that descends through Palangan has, over time, produced something ecologically improbable in this landscape. A cold water trout fishery operating at the center of an otherwise arid mountain region, fed entirely by springs emerging from the canyon walls above the village. No reservoir, no pump, no intervention beyond the stone-channeled runs that the community built and has maintained across generations. Trout are raised in runs no wider than a doorway. Harvested in the afternoon, split and pressed flat against wooden frames, grilled directly over walnut wood fires on the wider terrace levels where families gather in warm weather to eat outside. The smell of wood smoke and fish moves outward and downward through the canyon air in the late afternoon, the direction of the draft carrying it toward the valley floor rather than upward, so that the canyon fills gradually with the evidence of the evening meal before the meal itself begins. Tea is drunk, sitting at the water's edge where the sound of the spring current is loud enough that conversation requires leaning close to be heard. A setting so acoustically particular that the Kurdish sung poetry tradition, performed in the open spaces between houses, sends its voice outward against the opposite canyon wall and receives it back slightly altered, having briefly belonged to the mountain before returning to the singer who first offered it. The two cliff faces are not identical communities. They are one community divided by a river and connected by a bridge that the residents of both sides built and both sides maintain. When the bridge floods in spring, the canyon is briefly two separate places. When the water drops, it becomes one again. The springs that feed the village are not distributed evenly. Some levels have abundant water, others require carrying. The allocation of spring access has been negotiated and renegotiated across generations in arrangements that are part practical agreement and part inherited custom. The boundary between the two having dissolved long ago into something that simply is how it works here. Disputes over water access are, in this context, not minor. Water is the reason the village exists where it does. The springs emerging from the canyon walls above the settlement are what made this specific location habitable rather than merely picturesque. Remove the springs and the canyon has nothing to offer but verticality and shade. The children who grow up moving vertically, descending to collect water, ascending to school, descending again for the fish runs, ascending to the household above to deliver something borrowed, develop a relationship with gradient that children raised on flat ground do not have. They read slope instinctively. They calculate effort in terms of height gained and lost rather than distance traveled. A kilometer uphill is a different thing from a kilometer on level ground, and they know this in their bodies before they know it as a concept. This embodied knowledge shapes how they move through every environment they subsequently inhabit. Former residents of Palangan who now live in cities describe finding flat streets slightly disorienting for reasons they cannot easily articulate. The absence of the vertical dimension, the loss of the constant physical calibration that the canyon required. The canyon is quiet in winter. The springs run more slowly in the cold months. The fish channels carry less traffic. Families gather indoors around fires whose heat radiates into adjacent walls and is felt slightly in the next household. The Kurdish sung poetry, performed in the open spaces between houses. In summer continues in winter through the walls. The mountain receives it regardless of the season. Abyane. In the central Carcass mountain range, at an elevation approaching 2,200 meters, a village appears from the road below as a dense cluster of structures the exact color of the hillside behind them. This is not coincidence. The building material of Abyane, a reddish clay mixed with straw and aggregate, contains iron oxide in concentrations high enough to stain the entire settlement a shade of burnt sienna that the surrounding rock shares precisely. At certain angles in certain light, the village is difficult to distinguish from the mountain. A peculiarity of this clay. It hardens with moisture rather than eroding from it. Every rain that has passed through this valley in the past 1,000 years has reinforced the walls rather than weakening them. The storms that would damage conventional mud construction have, here, made the buildings stronger. The streets of Abyane are narrow and partially covered. Moving through them from below is to move through a series of archways and passages where the light changes from open to filtered to near dark and back again within a few meters. The walls press close on both sides. The stone beneath the feet is worn to a smoothness that records, without commentary, how many feet have passed this way. The women of Abyane wear white headscarves printed with red roses and layered skirts of multiple colors. They wear them not for festivals, but for ordinary mornings, at the market, in the street, carrying water. This is simply how one dresses here. A tradition maintained not through formal instruction, but through the continuous fact of everyone around you doing the same. Old men sit beside wooden doors fitted with two separate knockers, one producing a deeper tone for male visitors, one a lighter tone for female. A distinction the household has observed without interruption for longer than the nation around it has existed in its current form. In summer, the rooftops become a second kitchen operating in slow time. Flat surfaces covered in apricots, grapes, figs and pomegranate seeds laid out to dry in the high-altitude sun. Seen from the hillside above, the village surface becomes a dense patchwork of amber and burgundy and gold laid across the iron-red base. The visual logic and the practical logic are the same logic. The dried fruit will sustain the village through the winter when nothing grows and the road becomes difficult and there is no point planning for a supply chain that may not arrive. Tea is drunk from copper samovars fired by walnut wood charcoal. The custom of holding a cube of rock sugar, nabat, between the teeth rather than dissolving it in the glass means the sweetness of each cup arrives gradually, calibrated to the drinker rather than the drink. A small but complete philosophy of patience, enacted several times each day. The men who sit in the village square in the early afternoon are not idle. They are performing a social function that the architecture of the village makes possible and the climate of the mountain makes necessary. The exchange of information, the maintenance of relationships, the slow work of community coherence that no formal institution can replace. Abyane has been photographed more than almost any village in Iran. The red buildings, the women in their white and red clothing, the old men with their distinctive hats. It is a visually specific place in a way that attracts cameras. The village is aware of this, has been aware of it for decades. The awareness has not changed the clothing. The women still wear what they wear. The men still sit where they sit. The dried fruit still covers the rooftops in summer. If anything, the attention from outside has reinforced rather than diluted the specificities of the place. The distinction between here and everywhere else made more conscious by the fact of being observed. In late October, the pomegranates on the rooftops are split and the seeds spread in shallow layers to dry. The color they produce, against the red-brown of the clay surfaces, is a particular shade of deep crimson that is reproducible nowhere else under the same conditions. The altitude, the angle of the autumn sun, the specific mineral content of the air above 2,200 meters, all of it contributes to a color that photographers travel from other countries to document. The families who spread those seeds do so because the seeds need to dry. The color is incidental. The beauty is a byproduct of the practical. This is a recurring quality of these villages. The aesthetic is not separate from the functional. It is the functional, seen from a sufficient distance. Horomon. Deep in the Zagros range, along the border between Iranian Kurdistan and Iraqi Kurdistan. At roughly 1,500 meters elevation, the mountains fold into a canyon system so deep that the valley floor receives direct sun for only a few hours each day. Horomon rises from the canyon wall in tightly receding tiers. Each level of housing set back slightly from the one below, so that the entire settlement, viewed from the valley floor, resembles a staircase carved into the face of the mountain, or a throne. The observation depends on how long you stand looking. Walls are dry stacked limestone without mortar, anchored by walnut wood beams built to flex slightly with the earth rather than resist it. In a region where earthquakes are not infrequent, rigidity is a liability. The buildings move when the ground moves. They have been moving with the ground for centuries, and they are still standing. Daily life follows the stepped pathways that connect every household. Men carry firewood up staircases too narrow for any wheeled vehicle. Women prepare food in open doorways where the view extends uninterrupted across the canyon. The canyon is always present, always visible, always the defining fact of being here. Each January, the village transforms. Pir Shalia, a midwinter ceremony that predates Islam in this region and has continued through every change of administration, occupation, and political system that has touched these mountains, fills the stepped terraces with communal fires. Enormous clay pots are arranged on the open surfaces between houses, filled with lamb and wild walnut and slow-cooked over fires that multiple families tend together. The preparation is a collective act. Every family contributing labor rather than ingredients, the finished dish belonging to no single household. The walnut used in this cooking is not incidental. The Harriman Valley produces a wild variety with a bitterness that the long cooking process slowly converts into a flavor that carries within it the specific mineral character of this particular canyon. It cannot be reproduced from walnuts grown anywhere else. The taste is the place. By evening, families gather on the highest terrace where the last light lingers longest. Daff drums begin from multiple points across the stepped stone village. The sound descends and bounces from the canyon walls and returns changed. And the community assembles itself through shared sound and shared heat as it has assembled on this night, in this place, in this cold, for longer than anyone can accurately trace. UNESCO inscribed Harriman on the World Heritage List in 2021. The designation acknowledges what is already obvious to anyone who has stood in the canyon at dusk and listened to the drums. That what is being maintained here is not architecture. It is something older than architecture. The architecture simply holds it. The language spoken in Harriman is Harami, a Kurdish dialect so distinct from standard Sorani that linguists classify it separately, with roots going back to before the major Kurdish dialect groups diverged. It is spoken here, in this canyon, and in the corresponding villages across the border in Iraqi Kurdistan, and almost nowhere else. The canyon preserved it the way canyons preserve everything, by being difficult to cross, by slowing the movement of people and the mixing of language that movement produces. The women of Harriman knit while they walk. Between one household and the next, between the upper tier and the lower, along the stepped pathways that connect the levels of the village, the hands are always working. The wool comes from the sheep that graze the upper slopes in summer and descend to the sheltered lower pastures in winter. The patterns in the knitting are specific to this valley. Recognizable to anyone from here, different from the patterns of the villages across the mountains, even where those villages are only an hour's walk away. The difference is not decorative, it is a marker. The pattern says, this person is from here, this household, this specific place in this specific canyon. On ordinary days, the stepped terraces between houses serve as the village commons, the space where the business of the community that cannot be conducted inside any single household gets done. Tools are shared on these surfaces. Disputes are mediated here. Information moves between households through the casual traffic of daily life along the pathways, without any formal mechanism for its distribution. This is how a village of this density maintains coherence without institutions. Not through formal arrangement, but through architecture that makes avoiding your neighbors practically impossible. The stepped design that looks, from the valley floor, like a formal declaration of community is, from inside, simply the geography within which ordinary life unfolds. You pass your neighbors because the path goes past their door. You stop because stopping is what you do when you pass someone's door. The community maintains itself through the accumulated small moments of proximity that the architecture makes unavoidable. In the depths of winter, when snow fills the canyon and the upper tiers are accessible only with effort, the village contracts. Households turn inward. The fires that have been burning on these terraces for centuries burn in the interior rooms instead. The stone absorbs the heat and holds it. The walnut beams flex slightly in the cold, as they were built to do, distributing stress through the joints rather than concentrating it in any single point. The building moves. The building endures. This is the same sentence. Lahijan? Move north now, down from the mountains to the Caspian coast, where the climate reverses everything you have learned about Iran. Lahijan sits in the Gilan province at the base of the Albos range, where the mountains catch the moisture coming off the Caspian Sea. The rainfall here exceeds 1,300 millimeters annually, more than most of Western Europe, falling in a landscape that receives it with a density of green that looks, to anyone arriving from the central plateau, almost implausible. Tea grows here, not as an import or a specialty crop, as a fact of the landscape, as natural in this context as wheat is to the plains. The hillsides above Lahijan are covered in tea plantations that have been productive since the early 20th century. When an Iranian diplomat brought plants back from India and discovered that the climate of Gilan was, in the relevant particulars, identical to Assam. The picking season runs from late spring through early autumn. Women move through the rows in the early morning before the heat rises, filling baskets with the 2 leaves and a bud that produce the finest grade. The movement is continuous, rhythmic, the same motion repeated 10,000 times before noon. The smell of fresh tea leaves is particular, green and slightly astringent, nothing like the brewed cup it will become. The houses of the old neighborhoods in Lahijan are built on wooden stilts, raised above the damp ground with wide verandas facing the garden. The architecture is not stone, it is timber, the wood of the forests that cover every slope above the city, available in abundance in a way that stone-built villages of the plateau could not imagine. The veranda is where life happens in the warmer months. Tea is prepared continuously, served to whoever passes, the hospitality of this climate expressed through a refusal to let a guest sit without something in their hands. The samovar on the veranda is never fully cold. In the tea houses that line the older streets of the city, men sit for hours over single glasses, the conversation moving as slowly as the afternoon light across the garden. The social function of the tea house here is not the tea. The tea is the reason for the duration. The duration is the point. The surrounding landscape, wet, forested, loud with birdsong in ways the central plateau is not, produces a quality of daily life that is gentler in its physical demands than what the mountains require. The air is soft, the ground is soft, the rain arrives so regularly that there is no anxiety about it. But the mountains are always visible on clear days, rising behind the city, close enough to remind you that the plateau is not far, that the other Iran begins just beyond the tree line. The tea harvest requires a specific kind of attention. Not the sustained physical effort of the mountain villages, the climbing, the carrying, the building against weather, but a different kind of endurance. The rows are long. The motion repeats 10,000 times in a morning without variation. The attention required is not to the difficulty of the task, but to the quality of it. The correct 2 leaves and a bud, the avoidance of the stem, the maintenance of a rhythm that keeps the basket filling at the right rate. Women who have been picking tea since childhood do this without apparent effort. The hands know the motion so completely that the mind is released to other things: conversation, song, the particular quality of the morning light through the wet leaves. This is skilled labor that has been internalized until it is no longer experienced as labor. The tea houses of Lahijan are architectural expressions of an attitude toward time that the central plateau, with its rigors and its urgencies, does not quite share. Here, time is available. The climate provides. The tea grows without drama. The river does not need to be managed with the precision that the qanat required. The landscape is generous, and generosity produces a different relationship with duration. An hour in a Lahijani tea house over a single glass is not a waste of time. It is the use of time for its actual purpose, which is the maintenance of a community, the exchange of what people know, the simple confirmation that the people around you are still present and still themselves. The samovar on the veranda is never fully cold. This is not an accident. It is a commitment. The forests above Lahijan are the reason the city looks the way it does. Timber is the dominant building material here, not because stone is unavailable, but because in a landscape this wet, wood grows faster than stone can be quarried and processed, and the forest has always been closer than the mountain. The old neighborhoods of Lahijan are built in a style that has more in common with the wooden architecture of Northern Europe than with anything on the Iranian plateau. Pitched roofs to shed the rain, deep overhangs to protect the walls, elevated floors to keep the damp ground at a distance. These buildings age differently from stone. They gray. They warp slightly with the seasonal cycle of wet and dry. The wood develops a surface texture over decades that no finish can replicate. A combination of weathering, moss, the staining of tannins from the surrounding oak forest, and the particular color that timber achieves when it has been rained on thousands of times and dried in the thin winter sun thousands more. The houses that are 50 years old look like they belong here. The houses that are 300 years old look like they grew here. In summer, the veranda becomes an extension of the interior in a way that the harsh winters of the plateau villages would not permit. Meals are eaten outside. The evening is spent outside. The threshold between inside and outside dissolves in the warmth, and the household expands to include the garden, the neighbors' gardens, the street beyond. The whole texture of a summer evening in a place where summer evenings are reliably pleasant. Guests are received on the veranda as a matter of course. The hospitality of Gilan is expressed through immediacy. The tea that appears before the guest has sat down, the plate of fruit that materializes from somewhere before the conversation has properly begun. This is not performance. It is the rhythm of a household that maintains its samovar at operational temperature throughout the day, because the day, in this climate, regularly delivers people who need to be received. The children who grow up in Lahijani households learn this hospitality the way they learn Gilaki, not as instruction but as absorption. By the time they are old enough to pour tea without assistance, they already know the correct weight of welcome to apply to a stranger versus a regular visitor versus a family member, and the specific form of attention that each requires. This knowledge is not written anywhere. It lives in the practice of the household, transmitted through proximity to people who already have it. When these children move to Tehran for university, they take the knowledge with them. The friends they make there describe the experience of visiting a Gilaki household for the first time as unexpectedly disorienting. The warmth is genuine, but the scale of it takes adjustment. The constant presence of tea and food and attention, a form of generosity that requires learning to receive gracefully. The Caspian coast taught them this, the wet green landscape that provides without drama, that does not require the careful rationing of resources that the plateau demands. Generosity is not a virtue here so much as a response to abundance. The tea grows. The fruit falls. The guests are welcome. Bisotun. At the western edge of the Zagros Range, where the mountains begin their descent toward the Mesopotamian plain, a limestone cliff rises abruptly from the floor of a valley that has served as a crossroads for as long as anything in this part of the world has moved between places. The cliff at Bisotun is 1,200 meters high. Its face is vertical, and carved into that face, at a height of approximately 100 meters, accessible in the 6th century BCE only by scaffolding, by laborers working on ropes above a drop that would have been fatal, is the largest rock inscription ever produced in the ancient world. Darius the Great ordered it. In 3 languages simultaneously, Old Persian, Elamite, Babylonian, he recorded his victories, his genealogy, his divine authority. The text is accompanied by a carved relief showing Darius with his foot on a conquered enemy, 9 rebel leaders bound in a line before him. The inscription runs for 100 lines per language. 300 lines of text carved at altitude, in stone that was meant to last forever. It has. The village that exists below the cliff today is small. A few hundred people. The road passes through it without pausing. The cliff above is the reason anyone comes, and the cliff is not the village's. But the village predates the archaeological designation, predates the UNESCO inscription, predates every administrative decision that has been made about this stone. The families here have been living below this cliff for generations that none of them can fully count. In the morning, the shadow of the cliff falls across the village rooftops. By afternoon, the sun has cleared the ridge and the stone above glows a pale gold that changes gradually to amber as the light drops. The inscription is not visible from the village at ground level, too high, the letters too small at this distance, but the carved relief is. The figure of Darius, 1 foot forward, stands against the sky above the chimney smoke. The daily life of the village below has nothing to do with ancient Persian kingship. Women carry water, men tend the small fields on the valley floor. Children go to the school that was built in the 1970s, study subjects that bear no relation to cuneiform script. But the cliff is always there. The inscription is always there. The relief of a king who ordered this work, done 2,500 years ago, is always visible from every window on the north side of the village. The families who live in those houses have ceased, through simple familiarity, to register what they are looking at. This is its own kind of inheritance. To grow up beneath something so old and so permanent that it becomes ordinary. That the monument and the mountain behind it, and the valley below, and the road passing through become simply the view. The context within which a life is lived, not history. Background. The inscription at Bisotun was, for centuries, known to travelers who passed through the valley on the route between Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. one of the ancient world's great overland corridors used by caravans, by armies, by pilgrims, by anyone moving between east and west before the modern road system made such routes obsolete. Every one of those travelers passed below the inscription. Most could not read it. The languages it was written in had been dead for centuries before most of the travelers were born. But they knew it was there, referred to it in their accounts, described the carved figure of the king above the road as a landmark, a waypoint, a sign that you were in a particular place and not another. The village at Bisotun has been a waypoint for as long as the inscription has been a landmark. The two are inseparable in the geography of this valley. You stop here because the cliff is here. You stop here because the spring beside the cliff is here. You stop here because whoever is coming from the east and whoever is coming from the west will both pass through this narrow place between the mountain and the plain. The families who have lived here for generations know the cliff in ways that no archaeologist knows it. They know how the rock face changes color through the seasons, the gray of winter, the pale gold of summer, the brief amber flush in autumn when the light is at the right angle. They know which sections of the path below the inscription are slippery after rain. They know the sound the wind makes when it moves through the carved recesses of the relief. A sound that is not quite wind and not quite voice, and that children growing up here incorporate into their understanding of normal without thinking to ask what produces it. The inscription records the victories of a king who has been dead for 2,500 years. The village below records, in the accumulated wear of its paths and the soot of its hearths, and the particular way its families navigate their shared spaces, the ongoing fact of lives being lived in the shadow of permanence. Both are records. Neither is more real than the other. Seven villages, 7 geographies, 7 communities separated by altitude, language, climate, and the particular character of the rock beneath their feet. But the same logic repeated with a consistency that stops feeling like coincidence after a while and starts feeling like discovery. In none of these villages did human settlement attempt to override the landscape it occupied. No hillside was leveled, no canyon was rerouted, no grid was imposed on ground that refused to be flat. At Masule, a 60-degree incline became the structural logic of the entire settlement. The impossibility of flat ground produced a village in which every surface is both floor and ceiling simultaneously. At Kandovan, the volcanic cone became the room itself. The material that needed to be removed to create the space became, in its remaining form, the walls and ceiling and floor of a dwelling. At Palangan, 2 opposing cliff faces became the twin walls of a single community. The river between them became the center rather than the division. At Abyane, a clay that hardens in rain rather than dissolving in it became the building material of a settlement that has been reinforced by every storm for 1,000 years. At Haraman, limestone without mortar, built to move with the earth rather than resist it, has survived centuries of a mountain that does not stay still. At Lahijan, the same moisture that makes most architecture difficult became the condition for a landscape so productive that hospitality could be expressed as a continuous act rather than an occasion. At Bisotun, the cliff that would have made settlement impractical anywhere else became the reason for settlement. The permanence of the stone above became the context in which daily life below is conducted. The architecture did not shape the land. The land shaped the architecture. and the architecture accepted those terms without negotiation. This is what the builders of these villages understood, not through theory, not through written doctrine, but through the accumulated practice of generations working in the same place with the same materials under the same conditions. That the landscape is not an obstacle to be overcome. It is a set of properties to be understood. The volcanic tufa of Kandovan insulates because of its density and porosity. The limestone of Haraman distributes seismic force because it is not bonded rigidly. The clay of Abiane hardens with moisture because of the specific mineral composition of this particular hillside. The springs of Palangan feed a fishery because of the temperature and mineral content of this specific aquifer. Each property was not invented, it was found and then used generation after generation until the using of it became indistinguishable from the place itself. In all 7 villages, the boundary between private space and communal space is either blurred or functionally absent. The roof of one household is the courtyard of another. The pathway between 2 houses passes across a third family's living surface. The kitchen fire warming one dwelling radiates into the wall of the next. This is not an absence of privacy. It is a deliberate architecture of interdependence. The physical expression of an understanding that where the environment applies constant pressure, the individual household is not a sufficient unit of survival. Only the connected whole is resilient enough to endure what any single structure facing the same conditions in isolation could not withstand alone. There is a word that recurs in different forms across all 7 of these communities when you ask residents to describe what their village gives them that a city cannot. The word in each case is some version of belonging. Not nostalgia, not attachment to the past. Something more immediate and more physical. The feeling of being in a place that was built to exactly the specifications of the life being lived in it, where every surface has been worn to the shape of the people who use it, where the architecture and the community have over time become so completely adapted to each other that separating them is no longer possible. The tea glass held with both hands against the cold. The cooking pot resting in the depression worn by generations of the same gesture. The path between 2 houses worn smooth by every foot that has used it. These are not symbols, they are facts. Material facts, pressed into stone and wood and clay by the simple continuous pressure of lives being lived. The Iran that appears in news cycles, abstract, contested, difficult to hold in a single image, is a real place. Its complications are real complications. But it contains these villages, has always contained them, will contain them long after the current headlines are forgotten. The way the cliff at Bizotun contained its inscription through the fall of the empire that carved it. Through every subsequent occupation, every subsequent name for the land beneath it. The land asked a question. These communities answered it, and the answer is still standing.